Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome to the channel, and today we're going to be doing a guide on this. This is the QN506. It's the reward vehicle for the last crafting event, the top tier ground one. It's a Chinese light tank, and man, is it an unusual vehicle. It has some issues, and we're going to be going over them in this video. Now, as a side note about this video, the commander side on this QN506 is currently bugged. I have a separate little clip about that, but a link is in the description if you want to check it out. Gaijin haven't fixed it yet, but presumably they will at some point, but who knows. Now, as a side note about the vehicle, it is important to note it is a light tank, so you have artillery strikes, you have scouting, and you also have a reconnaissance drone, so it's important to remember to use those. However, as you're going to see later, this vehicle kind of has a little too much going on, and you're probably going to forget that you have some of these features over the course of the map. And let's get started by talking about the armor, or more specifically the lack of armor. My initial thought when seeing this vehicle was it's a T-55. T-55s are at least kind of resistant to things like autocannons. Unfortunately, that's not really the case. So while the front hull has a maximum protection of around 200mm depending on where you hit it, the sides are fairly weak, and this entire superstructure is incredibly weak. Basically anything can punch through the superstructure. It's only around 60 to 80mm of pen at most. Some parts are even thin enough that you can 50 cal it. And you might think, well, there's an unmanned turret, so at least you have that going for you, except the unmanned turret has a lot more ammo than you would think it does. So the unmanned turret tends to go up if it gets hit a lot too. So this creates a lot of problems in terms of durability, especially considering that you only have like a 3-man crew. You have just enough armor to create effective shrapneling, but not enough armor to realistically stop anything. So unless you get fairly lucky, you're probably not going to survive any hits from basically anything. Now, Gaijin have modified the armor on this thing several times, and I'm not entirely sure exactly what they've changed. Originally, you could get overpressured if a round hit the turret, like a high explosive or a heat round. Even if it didn't have any ammo, it would still kill your crew through the roof of the tank. They said they fixed it. I haven't experienced it since, but I can't actually confirm it. There also appears to be something weird going on with the missiles, where they used to explode all the time. Now it seems like it's kind of a dice roll. Like sometimes it's just an ammo cook-off that doesn't really hurt you, like you just lose the missile, but other times it will just destroy the vehicle, so I'm not entirely certain like what's going on with that. But yeah, like the durability is at best wildly inconsistent, and by and large you should just assume that you can't really take a hit. Most enemies can just click on the middle of you and easily take you out. And of course that brings us to the mobility, which is not good. With a good crew and fully upgraded, the mobility it's not completely unusable, but you are going to be slower than almost everything at your battle rating. Stock and with a bad crew, this thing is actually kind of awful in terms of mobility. If you get on any kind of rough terrain or incline, you're basically just dead in the water. So in terms of mobility, you're not going to be able to beat any teammates or enemies to key spots. You can't even really turn and pivot that well because it has a classic Soviet poor reverse gear to it. So the mobility is pretty bad, and honestly that was one of the more tedious parts of playing this vehicle, is just an inability to get into consistently good positions. So you kind of just had to play, I had to play reactively just because I couldn't guarantee that I could get somewhere before a teammate was already there or before an enemy was watching it. So rolling into the firepower, this is where the vehicle gets kind of interesting. And the first thing to note about this turret is that it only has 5 degrees of gun depression, and I'm not really sure if that's correct, but for the time being that is what it has. So your ability to use hills is actually very limited, despite the fact that it looks like this turret should be able to use them effectively. You essentially have to get a flat piece of ground behind the hill and try to peek over it, which can get a little awkward. You do have an auto tracker to track aircraft, and I'm not sure if this is bugged, but for some reason every time I locked onto an aircraft, even well after the aircraft had left line of sight or been destroyed, I couldn't get the auto tracker off of it for several seconds. So it seems like there might be some kind of bug with how the auto tracker currently works. As far as the main gun, it's a 30mm autocannon. The rate of fire seems roughly equivalent to a Bradley plus or minus, so it's not blazingly fast, but it's not as painfully slow as something like the Warrior either. And this is where we start getting into our first bit of awkwardness, especially if you're not a content creator test driving it, if you're just a normal pleb having to research it. This vehicle starts with a 50-50 mix of HVAP rounds and high explosive rounds. And given that the rate of fire isn't that high, and also the damage on these like subcaliber rounds isn't like ridiculous, you can end up losing a lot of gunfights even against fairly light vehicles where you shoot first because there just aren't enough lethal rounds in your belt. And this kind of gets to be, like, it's still awkward even as you research better belts, because next up you have the HVAP belt, which is a rank 3, which actually takes a minute to get to, and you can only take one HVAP belt, and your second belt has to be the 50-50 like HVAP HE mix at that point. So you're still not like that good, but you at least have a full belt of HVAP, even though it doesn't have the best pen. And then at rank 4, you finally get the good belt, which is the full APFSDS, the full dart belt. And that's actually pretty solid, but yet again, you can only take one of them, but you can at least have your backup be the full HVAP. So until you get this thing up to rank 4 and get that dart belt, the gun is actually a lot less consistent than you might see in some of the content creator videos where they're just test driving it fully upgraded. And I actually found it was pretty tedious to get all the way up to rank 3 and at least get the first HVAP to begin with. But once you get the full dart belt and you have a backup full HVAP belt, it's actually pretty respectable in terms of the gun and how it performs against light tanks, or even in most medium tanks from the side. It can generally shred them pretty efficiently. And the next weapon we're going to talk about, I guess we'll call these the micro missiles. These are the smaller missiles. You have 20 of them. These missiles are what's referred to as SACLOS, and SACLOS missiles will essentially go wherever you're aiming your crosshair. These are laser beam riding missiles. You can't shoot them while moving, although I'm not entirely sure why, given that you have a fully stabilized mounting and they're beam riders. Like, you should be able to, but the game just says no. The big problem with these missiles is that they don't perform dramatically better against the most targets than the dart belt that you get with the main gun. And this was kind of the biggest downfall. The only time I really used them is while I was spading the vehicle, because the missiles were more consistent than the 50-50 like HVAP HE mix. And then once I got the dart belt, I just kind of stopped using them because they just felt wholly redundant. There was so little that I could kill with the missiles that I couldn't just kill with the dart belt that I just kind of ignored them from that point on. And next up, we're going into probably the main event and the reason why a lot of people looked at this vehicle to begin with. These are the fire and forget missiles. You have 4 of these. These actually got updated and patched so that you can shoot them while moving, which is pretty cool. They are infrared guided, so you have to see a heat signature, and you fire them. They drop initially pretty sharply, then they pull up. However, this does not mean they're a top attack missile. They actually attack level with the target. They just kind of do this like high arc and then drop down level in attack, which is really weird. This behavior also means that these missiles are they tend to hit like barrels, tracks, or just bounce off ERA way more often than you'd think they would, and considering you only have 4 of them, that's kind of a drawback. It's also worth mentioning that the tracking system is not the best. It's been very inconsistent during my playtime in terms of what it does and doesn't like to lock on. For example, you can have an enemy where all you can see is your turret, and the missile's perfectly fine with that, but then you can have enemies that are almost completely exposed and the missile can't see them. I've even had enemies in the open where the missile gets up in the air and then just loses track and self-destructs. So I'm not entirely sure what type of heat signature these missiles are looking for, and even after spading it, I still don't feel like I have a great concept for what is a good sight picture. Additionally, the missiles are really inconsistent. Like, I've had a lot of instances where I've just gotten critical hit after critical hit, or I've hit a relatively light target like a Gepard or something, and it does damage but doesn't destroy them. Or, you'll just annihilate some of the toughest tanks in the game. The missiles are just all over the place in terms of damage, and because you don't control them, you can't try to increase their odds of success, or at least I haven't found any way to do so. Additionally, these missiles can lock onto friendlies, and they really like locking onto destroyed vehicles, and this can lead to a lot of awkward fights, especially on parts of the map where a lot of fighting has taken place. And this really, it makes these missiles at best kind of a gimmick. Like, sometimes you'll find good positions for them, but a lot of times you'll just run into a lot of limitations, like you're just not seeing enough of the enemy to lock, or there's too many destroyed vehicles around, or there's so much foliage, like trees and stuff, that as soon as the missile lopes up and gets altitude, it loses track and self-destructs. So you kind of need very specific positions to make these missiles work. So this kind of laterally brings us into the main missile's ability to take on aircraft, or specifically helicopters. You can certainly shoot them at planes, they'll track a plane, but they don't seem anywhere near fast or maneuverable enough to hit a plane, or at least I was never able to, despite doing some attempts at it. Helicopters, it's a different story. They are reasonably good at hitting helicopters. However, there are some strong limitations in terms of the anti-helicopter role. Number one, the missiles aren't terribly agile, so if the helicopter sees the missile coming, a lot of times they can just dodge it. Additionally, sometimes they'll just accidentally dodge the missile if your other teammates are also shooting at them. But the real problem, and the reason I don't like it for the anti-helicopter role, is the travel time. The travel time on these missiles is actually kind of ridiculous if you're stretching the range of it out to the maximum. I believe the longest range I've had in terms of like launch to impact was around 48 seconds of flight time. And depending on the helicopter and its missile, that's enough for it to kill 3 or 4 of your teammates before the missile impacts. Certainly, if you're in an exposed position, that's more than enough time to kill you. So at that point, you're just hoping to trade with the helicopter. And the big reason I don't like this in the anti-helicopter role is just China's options around this battle rating. The PGZ-04A, if you're within range to lock the missiles, the PGZ-04A is just straight up better. The missiles travel faster, they track better, they're generally flare resistant. They're actually pretty good against helicopters, even though they're basically useless against planes. And then, of course, you have the Z9W and the Z9WA that have the always amazing TY-90s, like some of the best air-to-air missiles in the game. They consistently ignore flares, they easily lock, they easily track. So if you really don't like helicopters, I wouldn't recommend using this vehicle. Like, China just has better options at this battle rating. And this would normally be the part in the video where I tell you like where I think this vehicle works best in terms of like what ranges or positions, and I just can't with this vehicle. The problem is you don't have the mobility to push for good positions. If you're brawling at close range, all of your missiles are basically useless. You're reliant on the gun, so if there's something that your gun can't consistently kill quickly, you're just going to have problems. Like most main battle tanks can just push you and murder you. If you get to medium range, the bigger missiles become very hit or miss. You're pretty much vulnerable to everything at every range. And then, of course, if you push it to long range, you only have 4 missiles, and they're very inconsistent. You only have 4 of the big missiles, they're very inconsistent. The gun is okay against light tanks, but at long range against mediums, it's not that great. So yeah, like you can't consistently get to a position even if you know you can use it. And of course your gun depression is just awful. It will hurt you if you have like any hills or anything that you have to navigate. And this is where like there's just no position where it's good. It's almost purely reactive as a vehicle, both down to its incredibly poor survivability and incredibly poor mobility, and how inconsistent the weapons are. So it's just kind of not good anywhere. And this brings us to like a weird quasi-meta problem with the vehicle. The vehicle has active scouting, it has artillery strikes, it has drones, it has 3 different weapons. All of the weapons have different targets they can engage and different criteria for using them. And this just created a package that was just kind of overwhelming to play. Like there's just too much stuff going on at once, and I always felt like I was just forgetting to use some of the features, like I was just forgetting to scout or forgetting to use the drone properly. And it's not, like obviously this is going to vary from person to person, but it did make it less fun to play when you don't feel like you can effectively use all that vehicle has going on. And this is where, like, if you're asking yourself, should I try to pick up one of these? I mean, it does have the novelty of being the very first ground vehicle in the game with anti-tank guided missiles that are fire and forget, so that's pretty neat. It is kind of a unique play experience, but the process of spading it is pretty frustrating. China has a robust enough lineup at this battle rating, you don't really need it, it doesn't add anything, and there's no way to get consistently good value out of it. So it's not very functional, but it is at least unique, so if it's cheap enough and you have the money for it, you could do worse. But I definitely don't think this is a particularly good buy by any stretch of the imagination. And that wraps us up for this video. Hope you enjoyed it, hope you have a great time. I hope you get at least some level of enjoyment if you're playing the QN506. If you have any ideas for future videos, drop them down in the comments. Have a nice day, everybody!